the city never truly slept. Its lights cast a glow over towering skyscrapers, and its streets echoed with the hum of constant movement. In the midst of it all, Alexander Blackwood thrived, or so it appeared. From the outside, he was the embodiment of success, a self-made millionaire whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and headlines alike. Yet behind the tinted windows of his chauffeured car and the walls of his penthouse, Alexander lived a life defined by rigid schedules and quiet isolation. Each morning began the same. His alarm buzzed at precisely 6 a.m. He dressed in tailored suits, his reflection in the mirror polished but devoid of emotion. His coffee, black, no sugar, sat untouched until the first sip, a ritual as mechanical as the rest of his day. By 7 a.m., he was seated in the back of his sleek black sedan, shuffling through emails on his tablet, oblivious to the world outside. James Morgan, the man behind the wheel, was the constant in Alexander's otherwise solitary routine. For over a decade, James had driven Alexander through the city's chaotic streets, navigating traffic with practiced ease. He arrived promptly each morning, his uniform crisp, his demeanor professional. To most, James was invisible, a fixture of Alexander's success, much like the car he drove or the penthouse he maintained. But there was a quiet dignity in James's presence, a calmness that belied the complexity of his life. Though they shared years of proximity, Alexander and James rarely exchanged more than a few words. A nod, a brief greeting, and the occasional acknowledgement of traffic were the extent of their conversations. Alexander preferred it that way. His life was compartmentalized, and James was part of the background, a reliable cog in the machine that kept his world running smoothly. For James, the silence was a part of the job. He respected Alexander's boundaries, knowing that his employer valued efficiency over small talk. Yet, there were moments when James couldn't help but wonder about the man in the back seat. Despite his wealth and power, Alexander seemed perpetually distant, as though the very world he controlled offered him no joy. But James never pried. He simply drove his thoughts his own. Their lives could not have been more different. Alexander lived in luxury, surrounded by opulence, but untouched by it. His penthouse was immaculate, decorated by professionals, yet devoid of any personal touches. No family photos adorned the walls, no evidence of a life lived outside of work. To Alexander, emotions were liabilities, distractions that had no place in his carefully constructed empire. James, on the other hand, lived a modest life in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. His home was small but warm, filled with remnants of a past life. Old photographs, sheet music, and a well-worn saxophone tucked away in a corner. He lived alone, his days structured by routine and his nights filled with memories of a time when music was his world. Despite their stark differences, Alexander and James shared an unspoken understanding of routine and discipline. Both men moved through life with a sense of purpose, though their purposes could not have been more different. For Alexander, it was the pursuit of success, an endless climb with no clear summit. For James, it was the quiet fulfillment of duty, the steady rhythm of responsibility that had guided him through years of challenges. To the outside world, their relationship was a mere professional arrangement. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered, a sense that their worlds, so carefully kept apart, might one day collide. Neither man could have anticipated how profoundly that collision would change them both. The sky had been threatening rain all day, but it wasn't until the evening that the clouds finally gave in. Sheets of water hammered down on the city streets, painting the roads with a slick sheen that reflected the glow of streetlights. Alexander Blackwood, seated in the back of his car, barely noticed. His attention was fixed on his tablet, where emails and financial reports demanded his scrutiny. The world outside, with its chaos and unpredictability, was something James Morgan handled for him. James, as always, drove with calm precision. The rain didn't faze him. Years of navigating unpredictable conditions had made him a master of adaptation. But even the best drivers are not immune to the whims of machinery. Just as they turned onto a quieter stretch of road, the engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. The car coasted to a halt, the windshield wipers flailing helplessly against the torrent. "What's going on?" Alexander's voice was sharp, his eyes darting up from his tablet for the first time. "Engine trouble, sir," James replied evenly, though his brow furrowed as he tried to restart the car. The engine coughed weakly, but refused to comply. With a sigh, James turned off the ignition and reached for his phone. "I'll call for assistance." Alexander glanced at his watch, irritation flickering across his face. He hated disruptions to his schedule, and this was an unwelcome one. "How long will it take?" James hesitated. Given the weather and traffic, it could be a couple of hours. The answer did not sit well with Alexander, who leaned back with a huff. The car, though plush and spacious, felt confining under the relentless drumming of the rain. Minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant roar of thunder and the occasional sound of a car speeding past. Alexander's impatience got the better of him. "You've been doing this for years. How does something like this happen?" James didn't bristle at the question, though his hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel. "It's a machine, sir. Even the best-maintained ones can have their moments." The rain showed no sign of easing, and the lack of phone signal compounded the frustration. Alexander drummed his fingers against the leather armrest, his mind racing with irritation. Finally, he broke the silence again, more out of boredom than curiosity. "You mentioned once that you played music." James glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "I did, sir. A long time ago." "What kind of music?" Alexander's tone was casual, almost dismissive, but there was a hint of genuine interest beneath it. "Jazz," James said simply, the single word carrying with it a weight of unspoken stories. The response caught Alexander off guard. Jazz! It wasn't what he expected from the man who had spent over a decade silently driving him through the city. "Jazz," he repeated, as though testing the word. "Did you perform?" "For a while," James replied, his voice steady but quieter now. "Clubs, small venues. It was a different time." The rain continued to pour, the sound filling the car as Alexander absorbed this unexpected detail. He leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Why did you stop?" James hesitated, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. "Life has a way of steering you in directions you don't expect." Alexander frowned, unsatisfied with the vagueness of the answer. But something in James's tone stopped him from pressing further. The moment felt strangely intimate, as though they had stepped into uncharted territory in their relationship. For the first time in years, the divide between employer and employee seemed to blur, if only slightly. Outside, the rain began to lighten, though the sky remained dark and foreboding. The rhythmic tapping on the roof of the car slowed, and with it, the tension in the air seemed to ease. Alexander leaned back in his seat, uncharacteristically quiet, as James stared out at the empty road. Neither man spoke for a while, but the silence wasn't as oppressive as before. Instead, it felt like the start of something, an opening, however small, into lives that had remained firmly closed off. The morning after the rain-soaked breakdown, Alexander found himself replaying fragments of the previous night's conversation. Jazz! He couldn't reconcile the image of James, a quiet, unassuming chauffeur, with the vivid energy of a jazz musician playing under dim club lights. The thought lingered, interrupting his usual focus on emails and spreadsheets. For the first time in years, something unrelated to business had captured his attention. As James pulled the car into the driveway that morning, he noticed Alexander watching him through the rearview mirror. There was a flicker of something unusual in his employer's expression. Curiosity? Interest? It was a stark contrast to the impassive demeanor James had grown accustomed to. Still, he said nothing, waiting for Alexander to make the first move. During their drive through the bustling Manhattan streets, Alexander set his tablet aside, an action so rare it caught James off guard. "How long did you play jazz?" Alexander asked abruptly, breaking the usual silence. James hesitated, glancing at his employer in the mirror. "About 15 years, give or take." 15 years is a long time, Alexander remarked, his tone uncharacteristically conversational. Were you any good? A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth. I held my own, he replied modestly. I had a band. We played regularly, small clubs mostly, but we had our moments. Alexander nodded, intrigued but unsure how to press further without overstepping. The conversation veered back into silence, but it wasn't the same comfortable quiet they usually shared. It was charged, filled with the unspoken realization that James's life held more depth than Alexander had ever considered. Over the next few days, Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to the puzzle of James's past. The routine drives that had once been a blur now felt like an opportunity, an opening to learn more about the man who had been a fixture in his life for years but had remained an enigma. During one particularly slow afternoon drive, Alexander leaned forward. Why jazz? He asked, his tone softer this time. James, caught off guard, glanced briefly in the mirror before answering. Jazz is freedom, he said simply. It's about feeling, improvisation. It's not perfect, but it's alive. Alexander considered this, his gaze drifting to the cityscape outside the window. And you gave it up? He said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. James's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Not by choice, he admitted after a pause. Sometimes, life demands things from you, sacrifices you never see coming. The honesty in James's voice struck a chord in Alexander. He had never thought about James as someone who had sacrificed anything. In his mind, James had always been simply there, a constant presence, reliable and steady, but never extraordinary. Now, Alexander was beginning to see how wrong he'd been. What made you stop? Alexander asked, lowering his voice as though afraid the question might be too intrusive. James sighed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. My wife died in an accident, he said quietly. Left me with a young son to raise. Music doesn't pay the bills, not reliably anyway. So, I did what I had to do. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air. Alexander, for once, didn't have a response. He sat back in his seat, his mind turning over James's story. The picture of James as a man who had once lived for music, only to trade it for stability, was profoundly moving. Alexander realized how little he truly knew about the people around him. How easy it was to assume simplicity where complexity thrived. From that moment on, Alexander began to pay closer attention. James, who had always seemed a peripheral figure in his life, was now someone worth understanding. The revelation unsettled him, but it also stirred something deeper, a curiosity not just about James, but about his own life and what he might be missing. It was late one evening, the city's glow muted under a blanket of thick clouds. The usual rhythm of their rides felt different, heavier somehow, as if both men were waiting for something unsaid to surface. Alexander, leaning back in his seat, stared out the window but wasn't seeing the passing streets. His mind was elsewhere, circling around the fragments of James's life that had come to light over the past few days. The silence stretched, and for the first time, Alexander broke it with deliberate intent. You mentioned your wife and son the other day. He began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. And that you had to give up music. But you didn't say much about what those years were like. James glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might deflect the question, but then he spoke. Those years, he began, his voice slow, thoughtful. They were hard, but they were mine. Alexander waited, sensing that James wasn't finished. There was a weight to his tone that suggested more was coming, a story long buried but not forgotten. I met my wife, Lila, at a jazz club, James continued, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. She wasn't a musician, but she loved the music. Said it was the only thing that made her feel alive. We fell in love fast, too fast maybe, but it worked. For a while, Alexander found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the way James spoke, his words carrying a mix of nostalgia and pain. What happened? He asked softly. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel, the tension in his shoulders visible even in the dim light of the car. We had our son, Aaron. Things were good for a time. But then, Lila was driving home from work one night. A drunk driver ran a red light. He paused, his voice faltering. She didn't make it. The car seemed to grow colder, the air heavier with the weight of James's confession. Alexander felt a pang of guilt for prying, but knew that James needed to continue, to let it out. "I was left with a 2-year-old boy and no plan," James said, his voice steadier now, as though speaking the words gave him strength. "Music wasn't enough to keep us going. The gigs were unpredictable, the pay even worse. I had to make a choice. Keep chasing my dream, or make sure my son had a roof over his head. And you chose him," Alexander said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I did," James replied. "It wasn't a decision I regret, but it wasn't easy. Every time I packed away my saxophone, it felt like I was burying a part of myself. But Aaron needed stability, not a father chasing dreams in smoky clubs." Alexander was silent, absorbing the story. He had always viewed James as a man who simply existed in his orbit, a constant presence without complexity. But now, he was beginning to see him in an entirely new light, a man who had sacrificed his passion for love and responsibility. "What about now?" Alexander asked after a long pause. "Do you still play?" James's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Every now and then," he said, "when the house is quiet and I've got nothing but memories to keep me company. It's not the same, though. Playing for yourself isn't like playing for a room full of people." The answer lingered in the air, leaving Alexander with a strange ache he couldn't quite place. He thought about the decisions James had made, the weight of them, and how they had shaped the man he saw before him. It was a stark contrast to his own life, where wealth had shielded him from ever needing to make such sacrifices. James's story stayed with Alexander long after the ride ended. He found himself thinking not just about James, but about himself, about the things he had chosen to pursue and the things he had ignored. For the first time, Alexander began to wonder if his own life, built on financial success, was as full as he had always believed. That night, Alexander sat in the stillness of his penthouse, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. The glittering lights that once symbolized his power and success now seemed distant and hollow. His usual routine, pouring a glass of whiskey, reviewing financial reports, and preparing for another day of deals and negotiations, felt strangely insufficient. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself confronting an unfamiliar sensation: doubt. James's story had struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't just the tragedy or the sacrifices that lingered in his mind. It was the resilience, the quiet strength to let go of a dream for something greater. Alexander had always prided himself on his ability to make hard decisions, but they had never cost him in the way James's choices had. James had given up a piece of his soul, while Alexander had merely traded time for money. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and let his mind wander to his own life. Everything he had ever done was rooted in control, controlling outcomes, controlling relationships, controlling his image. He had built walls so high that even those closest to him couldn't see over them. And yet, for all his careful planning, his life felt devoid of the richness James had spoken of, even in its pain. Alexander's thoughts drifted to his family, or rather, the absence of one. He had no wife, no children, no one to share the quiet moments of his success. He had told himself over the years that relationships were distractions, liabilities in a world that demanded focus and ambition. But now, sitting alone in his cavernous apartment, he couldn't help but question the price he had paid for that single-minded pursuit. James's words about music being alive echoed in his mind. It's not perfect, but it's alive. Alexander's life, by contrast, felt meticulously perfect. But was it alive? He thought of the sterile opulence of his home, the carefully curated art on the walls, the furniture chosen by designers rather than by himself. It was all immaculate, but none of it was real in the way James's story had been. For the first time, Alexander considered the possibility that his wealth had not been a shield against hardship, but a barrier to truly living. He thought of the jazz clubs James had described, the smoky air, the hum of conversation, the improvisation that made every performance unique. It was a world Alexander had never entered, one where spontaneity and passion thrived, a stark contrast to the rigid structure of his own existence. As the hours ticked by, Alexander felt a restlessness building within him. He had always been a man of action, someone who found comfort in solving problems and making decisions. But this was different. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a checkbook or a strategic plan. It was a question of purpose, of meaning, and the answers weren't readily available. Alexander rose from his chair and walked to the window, his reflection faint against the glittering cityscape. He thought about James's son, the sacrifices James had made to ensure he had a stable life. Alexander realized he had never made such a sacrifice, not for anyone. He had lived his life in pursuit of things that could be measured: net worth, market shares, accolades. But the intangible, the connections, the moments that made life worth living, had eluded him. The weight of these thoughts settled over him, heavy but not unwelcome. For the first time, Alexander didn't feel the need to push them aside or distract himself with work. Instead, he let them stay, their presence a quiet reminder that something within him was changing. By the time the city's lights began to dim with the approach of dawn, Alexander had made a decision. He didn't know what shape it would take or where it would lead, but he knew he had to do something. James's story had awakened something in him, a spark of curiosity, a yearning to see beyond the walls he had built. And for a man like Alexander, the act of wanting something more was the first step toward transformation. The invitation came as a surprise, not just to James, but to everyone in Alexander's circle. Alexander Blackwood, the man known for keeping his personal life strictly private, had decided to bring his chauffeur to a prestigious charity gala. The event was a cornerstone of the city's social calendar, a gathering of powerhouses from business, art, and politics. For James, the idea of attending such an affair felt almost absurd. "Are you sure, sir?" James asked hesitantly as Alexander handed him the invitation, his tone laced with disbelief. "Absolutely," Alexander replied, his tone as calm and decisive as ever. "You've spent years driving me to events like these. It's about time you experienced one for yourself." James wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent his life in the background, a part of the machinery that kept others moving forward. The thought of stepping into the spotlight, however briefly, made him uneasy. Yet there was a sincerity in Alexander's gesture that made it hard to refuse. On the evening of the gala, James stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the unfamiliar bow tie around his neck. His usual uniform had been replaced with a borrowed tuxedo that fit him a little too snugly. He felt out of place, like an actor stepping into a role he wasn't sure he could play. But when Alexander greeted him at the car, dressed in his usual elegance, James felt a flicker of reassurance. The venue was dazzling, a sprawling ballroom adorned with glittering chandeliers and walls lined with artwork that likely cost more than James's house. As they entered, heads turned, not just because of Alexander's presence, but because of the man beside him. Whispers rippled through the crowd, their curiosity palpable. Who was this older gentleman, this stranger in the midst of Manhattan's elite? James did his best to stay composed, but the scrutiny was unsettling. Alexander, sensing his discomfort, leaned in and spoke quietly. "Don't mind them. You belong here just as much as anyone else." The evening unfolded with all the grandeur one might expect. Waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly in the background, and the city's most influential figures mingled effortlessly. James, however, found himself standing on the periphery, observing rather than participating. He felt like an imposter, a man out of step with the world around him. Then came the moment Alexander had planned, but hadn't shared. When the scheduled entertainment for the evening fell through, a last-minute cancellation that left the organizers scrambling, Alexander saw an opportunity. He turned to James, his eyes alight with an uncharacteristic spark of mischief. "You could play," Alexander suggested, his voice low but firm. James blinked at him, stunned. "Play? Here? Now? Why not?" Alexander asked, his tone light but his gaze steady. "You still got it? I know you do." James's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of performing in front of such an audience felt overwhelming, almost ludicrous. But as he looked at Alexander, he saw something unexpected: belief. It wasn't a demand or an order. It was an invitation, a chance to step back into a part of himself he had long buried. Before he could overthink it, James found himself being guided to the small stage at the front of the room. A spotlight clicked on, illuminating him as he stood there, feeling exposed and uncertain. A saxophone, part of the evening's unclaimed equipment, rested on a stand nearby. James picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the reed and tested the keys. It felt familiar, yet distant, like revisiting an old friend after years apart. He took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes were tentative, wavering like a voice unsure of its audience. But as the melody unfolded, James's confidence grew. The room fell silent, the hum of conversation fading as guests turned their full attention to the man on stage. The music was soulful and raw, carrying with it years of emotion, grief, love, longing, and resilience. It was a sound that spoke not just to the ears, but to the heart. By the time James finished, the room erupted into applause. The standing ovation was immediate and genuine, a wave of appreciation that left James momentarily speechless. He bowed his head slightly, his cheeks flushed with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. As he stepped off the stage, Alexander was waiting for him, his expression warm but unreadable. "I told you," Alexander said simply, his words carrying more weight than James could have anticipated. For the first time in years, James felt alive. The music, the applause, the connection, it was all still there, waiting for him. And in that moment, he realized that the spark he thought had been extinguished was still burning, ready to be rekindled. The idea for the Music Academy came to Alexander late one night as he sat in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. James's story had ignited something in him, a desire to do more than accumulate wealth, to leave a legacy that mattered. He envisioned a place where young people could discover their passion for music, just as James once had. It would be a way to give back, to create something meaningful out of their shared experiences. The next morning, Alexander presented the idea to James during their drive. "I want to start a music academy," he said, breaking the usual silence, "for kids who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity. And I want you to help me run it." James, caught off guard, glanced at Alexander through the rearview mirror. "Me? I don't know anything about running an academy." "You know music," Alexander replied firmly. "You know how to inspire. That's all that matters." James hesitated, doubt flickering across his face. "It's been years since I've taught anyone anything. What if I'm not up to it?" Alexander leaned forward slightly, his tone uncharacteristically encouraging. "You've been teaching me without even realizing it, James. You're more than up to it." The conversation left James thoughtful. The idea of mentoring young musicians appealed to him, but it also terrified him. He had buried his passion for so long that the thought of bringing it back to life felt almost overwhelming. Yet, as the days passed and Alexander began outlining his plans, James found himself drawn to the project. Slowly, his apprehension began to give way to a sense of possibility. As plans for the academy progressed, James realized there was one part of his life he couldn't ignore: his estranged relationship with his son, Aaron. Years of distance and misunderstandings had created a chasm between them, and James knew it was time to bridge it. One evening, James called Aaron, his voice tentative as he asked if they could meet. To his surprise, Aaron agreed, though his tone was guarded. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "You're opening a music academy?" Aaron asked, his expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "Why now?" James took a deep breath. "Because I realized I've been running from what I love, and because I want to make something good out of the time I have left." Aaron's gaze softened, but his voice was still tinged with hurt. "You ran from more than music, Dad. You ran from me." The words cut deep, but James didn't shy away. "You're right," he admitted. "I made mistakes. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I wasn't there in the ways that mattered most. I'm sorry, Aaron, for everything, The sincerity in James's voice seemed to reach Aaron, who nodded slowly. "I never hated you, Dad," he said quietly. "I just wanted to understand why you gave up on yourself." "I didn't give up," James said. I didn't know how to hold on to both you and the music, but I'm trying to find a balance now. Maybe it's too late, but I hope you'll give me a chance." Their conversation stretched late into the night, filled with shared memories and long overdue forgiveness. By the time they parted, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. The opening of the academy was a moment neither James nor Alexander could have anticipated months earlier. The building, once an abandoned warehouse, had been transformed into a vibrant space filled with practice rooms, a recording studio, and a modest performance hall. The community had rallied behind the project, drawn to its mission of providing opportunities to young musicians. The opening concert featured performances from the Academy's first group of students, ranging from shy beginners to remarkably talented prodigies. James had worked closely with them over the past few weeks, rediscovering his love for teaching in the process. Seeing their confidence grow and their passion ignite reminded him of his own journey, and it filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. As the concert reached its finale, James took the stage, his saxophone gleaming under the spotlight. He played a piece he had written years ago, a melody filled with longing and hope. The audience, including Aaron, sat spellbound, their applause thunderous when he finished. Alexander watched from the audience, a rare smile on his face. For the first time, he felt something he had never experienced in all his years of business: genuine pride in creating something that truly mattered. The Academy wasn't just a building or a project. It was a testament to the power of resilience, connection, and second chances. The Academy's grand concert was over, but the notes of the final performance seemed to linger in the air as James and Alexander sat together in the quiet auditorium. The students had gone home, and the hall, which had been alive with music and applause just an hour earlier, now rested in stillness. The faint scent of polished wood and lingering echoes of applause created an atmosphere of quiet triumph. James, still holding his saxophone, stared at it with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The journey back to this stage had been unexpected, paved with moments he never anticipated. He glanced at Alexander, who sat beside him, his usual reserved demeanor softened by an almost imperceptible smile. "You pulled me out of the shadows, you know," James said, his voice low and reflective. "I thought that part of my life was gone, but here I am." Alexander turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't need pulling, James. That music, it was always in you. You just needed someone to remind you of it." James chuckled, the sound rich and full of life. "You're too modest. You built this place. You gave these kids a chance. You gave me a chance." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting upward to the stage lights that now hung dimly overhead. For once, he felt no urge to downplay his role. The Academy, the students, the music, it had become something he was proud of in a way he had never expected. "I suppose we both found something here," Alexander admitted. "Purpose, maybe, or just a little piece of what we were missing." James nodded, his expression softening. "You know, I think you were right about something you said earlier about me belonging at that gala. It's strange, but tonight, watching those kids playing again, I felt like I belonged, like I was home." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning but light in their delivery. Alexander felt a warmth in his chest, an unfamiliar but welcome sensation that he recognized as fulfillment. For years, he had chased the kind of success that could be measured in numbers, only to find that the moments that truly mattered couldn't be quantified at all. The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, the faint hum of the city outside barely reaching their ears. Finally, Alexander stood and adjusted his jacket. "Come on, James. It's late. Let's go home." James placed his saxophone carefully back in its case, a small smile playing on his lips. "Home," he repeated softly, savoring the word. As they left the auditorium, the sound of faint laughter and music from a nearby practice room caught their attention. Alexander paused, turning to James with a question in his eyes. James waved him forward, his smile widening. "Let them play," he said. "They're finding their own melodies." The two men stepped outside into the crisp night air, the city lights stretching endlessly before them. Alexander glanced at James, a man who had become more than just a chauffeur, a friend, a mentor, a reminder of what life could be when lived fully. James looked back at Alexander, seeing a man who had helped him rediscover the joy he thought he'd lost forever. They walked toward the waiting car, their steps unhurried, their conversation light. The engine purred to life as James slid into the driver's seat, but Alexander, in an unusual gesture, asked him to wait. He opened the door and gestured toward the passenger seat. "Tonight, you ride up front," Alexander said with a grin. "Consider it a promotion." James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, moving to sit beside Alexander in the front seat. As they drove through the quiet streets, the hum of the car mingling with the city's nocturnal symphony, a sense of calm settled between them. In the distance, the skyline glimmered, promising endless possibilities. For Alexander and James, it wasn't just a city of buildings and lights. It was a canvas for new beginnings, painted with the melodies of their shared journey. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.